The wind off the Atlantic carried a sharp, metallic chill that night, the kind that slips under collars and settles in bones. Along the edge of Harbor Point, the old cooling warehouses stood like forgotten sentinels, their corrugated walls trembling each time a freight train moaned across the tracks. And somewhere in the maze of rusted pallets and abandoned containers, a man was dying. Sergeant Lucas Reed pressed one hand to the open wound near his ribs, feeling the warmth of blood seeping between his fingers. His vision blurred. His radio lay shattered 2 yards away. His breath came shallow, mingling with the cold fog rising off the docks. He had followed a lead alone. One container, one number, 47B. And someone had made sure it would be the last thing he ever investigated. His knees buckled. The night swallowed him whole. But Harbor Point was not silent. Down the service road, a boy walked beside a limping dog, the leash slack between them. Noah Castillo, headphones over his ears, eyes fixed on the familiar grid of tracks beneath his feet. At his side, the old K9 shadow padded slowly, breath forming white clouds in the air. Then, a sound only Shadow seemed to recognize. A sharp growl, a pull on the leash, a turn Noah never took. Within seconds, the retired K9 was dragging the boy toward the heart of the docks, toward a man clinging to his last heartbeat. And that was the moment. A single, fragile thread of fate. When a wounded officer's life became tied to a quiet boy, a weary father, and a dog who no longer owed the world anything, but still chose to answer. Morning in Harbor Point. Maine always arrived wrapped in silver. Fog rolled in first, slipping between the lobster boats and piling softly against the seawalls, as if the Atlantic itself was exhaling. The town was small. Just a scatter of shingled homes, weathered storefronts, and the ever-present railroads slicing across the coast. A place where life moved in tides, steady, predictable, quietly burdened, inside a second-floor apartment above a shuttered laundromat. Noah Castillo traced patterns on the frosted window with the tip of one finger. 11 years old, brilliant in ways that didn't fit neatly into school charts, and different in ways that the world wasn't always patient with. He counted the foghorns. He memorized the rhythm of freight trains. He cataloged the squeals of brakes the way other kids memorize baseball stats. For Noah, the world made sense when it moved in patterns. Beside him, a single object never moved, a framed photo of his mother, smiling on a pier that no longer existed. She'd passed 3 years earlier. 3 years of Miguel Castillo trying to become both mother and father, both anchor and sail, while holding a job that kept him exhausted and a son who kept slipping further into silence. Miguel loved Noah fiercely, but often felt like he was trying to reach him across a river with no bridge. Their saving grace was Shadow. The retired K9 entered their lives by accident, or providence. During a community adoption event, while other children shrieked and tugged on leashes, Noah stood still at the edge, hands pressed to his headphones, overwhelmed. Shadow, gray along the muzzle and limping ever so slightly, broke away from the crowd and simply sat beside the boy. No barking, no fanfare, just presence. Miguel had never seen his son let anyone that close, so Shadow came home with them. Now the dog slept beside Noah's bed, waited outside his classroom door, and walked with him every evening before Miguel began his night shift at the hospital. It was their ritual. Shine of street lamps on the wet asphalt, faint hum of cargo ships, Shadow's steady gait guiding Noah through the overwhelm. Life was not easy. Bills piled up. The heating struggled every winter. Miguel worked 2 jobs and still whispered prayers into darkness. But inside that small apartment, under soft lamplight and the distant echo of the sea, there was a quiet kind of love. Fragile, imperfect, but stubborn enough to endure. Harbor Point did not yet know it, but this little family. A father stretched thin, a boy who spoke mostly in patterns, and an aging dog with a fading badge, was about to change the fate of the entire town. Shadow had once lived a different life. A life of sirens, midnight chases, and the sharp command of a partner who trusted him with everything. Before the limp, before the scar hidden beneath his sable fur, Shadow had been part of Portland's K9 unit, trained to sprint through alleyways, detect explosives beneath ferry decks, and steady the heartbeat of the officers who leaned on him when fear ran too close. And for years, he'd done exactly that. Beside Sergeant Lucas Reed, they had been inseparable. Until the night a collapsing storage platform pinned Shadow's hind leg, ending his career in a single sickening crack of bone and metal. The department retired him with honors. Lucas visited him twice at the rehabilitation center and then simply stopped coming. Noah never knew that part, and Shadow never asked him to. To Noah, the dog wasn't a fallen hero. He was the only creature in the world who understood him without words. Shadow moved through the apartment with quiet dignity, navigating the narrow hallways as if they were old patrol routes. He nudged Noah's elbow when the boy spiraled into the overwhelming noise of his own thoughts. He placed one heavy paw on Miguel's knee on the nights the father returned home late. Hands trembling with exhaustion, he refused to show his son. And on their evening walks, Shadow transformed. Each step along the railroad tracks made the old dog stand taller, ears forward, muscles remembering what they used to be. He scanned the perimeter the way he'd once been trained. One glance to the water, one to the shipping yard, one to the shadows behind the crates. Noah noticed. He always noticed. "Shadows mapping," he whispered once, jotting notes into the small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket. His eyes trace a loop. Same pattern every night. Miguel didn't understand the significance, but he smiled anyway. If Noah was talking, even in fragments, it meant he felt safe. Some nights, when the fog rolled in low and the distant clang of cargo chains echoed across the docks, Shadow would pause near the old cold storage warehouse. The one abandoned after the fire 10 years earlier. A low rumble formed in his chest. Not fear, but memory. He never pulled Noah toward it. Not yet. But each time they walked by, Shadow's tail stiffened, his breath shortened, and his eyes, clouded with age but sharp with instinct, followed the dark line of containers stacked like silent tombstones against the night sky. Something had been wrong in Harbor Point for a long time. Shadow had known it before any human did. But dogs cannot speak. They can only wait and hope someone listens. And in this town of salt air and second chances, the one person who would listen, the one person who saw patterns where others saw chaos, was an 11-year-old boy with a battered notebook and a heart that understood what silence meant. The night it happened didn't begin as a night of danger. It began like all the others. Quiet, predictable, wrapped in the soft hum of Harbor Point's evening tide. Miguel tightened the strap of his work bag, preparing for another overnight shift, while Noah sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through the pages of his weathered notebook. Shadow lay beside him, head on Noah's knee, tail thumping gently with each page turned. 15 minutes. "Bud," Miguel said. "Quick walk before I head out." Noah nodded once, not looking up. Routine, structure, patterns. This was how the boy held the world together. They stepped into the chilly autumn air. The street lamps glowed hazy through the fog, casting long, blurred shadows across the pavement. Down the slope, the faint moan of a freight train wound its way toward the coastline, echoing across the deserted loading yards. Shadow trotted a few paces ahead. Steady, focused, familiar. Until he wasn't. Halfway down the trail that bordered the railroad, the dog stopped dead. One paw hovered above the gravel. His ears twitched sharply. His breath shortened to a single, low growl vibrating in his chest. Miguel frowned. "Shadow, what is it? Boy." The old K9 didn't look back. Instead, his body angled toward the far end of the tracks, toward the abandoned cold storage warehouse silhouetted against the glowing fog. Shadow pulled once, twice, hard. Noah froze, panic prickling behind his ribs. A break in routine. An unexpected path could unravel him. His breathing quickened. His fingers curled into fists. "Shadow, no, no new route," Noah whispered through his teeth, shaking his head rapidly. But then he saw the dog tremble. Not in fear, but in urgency. And something inside the boy shifted. He inhaled, counted to 4 the way his therapist taught him, and reached down to place a steadying hand on Shadow's back. "Oh, Okay, he whispered. We go your way tonight. Miguel blinked, stunned. Noah never deviated from a plan. Never. Shadow tugged again, this time guiding. Not dragging. Them along a narrow gravel strip bordering the warehouse compound. The air thickened with the scent of rust and salt. A loose metal sheet clanged in the wind like a warning bell. Then Noah heard it, a low, broken sound. Short, strained, human. Shadow lunged toward a collapsed stack of wooden pallets beside the far loading dock. His claws scraped against the wet concrete as he dug frantically at the debris. Miguel dropped to his knees, shoved aside a broken board, and the beam of his phone flashlight fell across a man's uniform. A badge, a blood-soaked shirt, a face drained of color. Sergeant Lucas Reed. His breasts were shallow, his lips blue, one hand pressed weakly against a wound that refused to stop bleeding. Noah stood frozen in the fog, the world narrowing into a single, trembling question scribbling itself into his mind. Why did Shadow bring us here? And how long had this man been alone? The night shift Miguel feared had just become the longest night of their lives. For a moment, none of them moved. The fog coiled low around the loading dock, gathering like a living thing. A distant buoy bell groaned from the harbor, echoing through the cold air. And beneath the jagged stack of broken pallets, Sergeant Lucas Reed clung to consciousness the way a man clings to the last rung of a collapsing ladder. Miguel's breath hitched. Dios mío! Lucas tried to lift his head, but the effort sent a tremor through his entire body. His voice cracked, barely audible beneath the hiss of wind. Don't let the lights move. They're watching the docks. Noah stood 3 feet away, hands hovering in the air, every instinct inside him caught between fear and fascination. His mind raced. Patterns, cause, effect. Searching for something he could do, something to anchor himself to. Shadow provided the anchor. The old K9 pressed his body against Noah's leg, grounding him before turning to nudge him forward, guiding him. Not with force, but with purpose. Toward the injured man, Miguel knelt and tore open his jacket. Blood soaked his sleeve instantly. He's bleeding bad, Miguel whispered, panic rising in his throat. His phone flickered. No bars. The storm layers rolling in from the ocean were killing the signal. Noah swallowed hard. He stepped closer. Dad, pressure. Needs pressure. Miguel blinked. What? Compression, Noah repeated, voice thin but steady. Our class, practiced with sponges. If pressure stays constant, bleeding slows. He knelt beside Lucas, placing trembling hands over the wound exactly the way he had learned. Miguel stared. His son, who hated touch, who recoiled from physical contact, was now leaning into a dying man without hesitation. Good boy, Lucas rasped, his eyes momentarily clearing. Shadow lay down on Lucas's other side, pinning the officer gently but firmly to keep him from rolling into shock convulsions. One of Lucas's trembling fingers brushed the dog's fur, recognition flickering through his pain-clouded gaze. You're still working, he whispered. Shadow pressed his head to the man's shoulder, as if answering. I never stopped. Miguel tried his phone again. Still nothing. He exhaled sharply, made a decision born of desperation. I'm running to signal range. Noah, keep pressure. Do not move. Shadow. Stay. Shadow raised his head, meeting Miguel's eyes. A silent contract passed between them. Miguel sprinted down the service road, disappearing into the mist. Noah counted aloud, fighting to maintain pace and breath. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Each number tethered him to control. Each compression held Lucas a moment closer to life. Minutes stretched long enough to feel like hours. Then, a faint wail in the distance. Sirens, growing louder, slicing through the fog like a blade of light. Miguel burst back into view with 2 EMTs behind him, their boots splashing through puddles as they slid beside Noah and Lucas. You did perfect, one EMT murmured, easing Noah back. You kept him alive. Noah blinked, unsure how to accept praise. Shadow nudged his shoulder, a quiet reassurance. You did good. As Lucas was lifted onto the stretcher, his fading voice rasped out one last message meant for no one and everyone. Container 47B, don't let them move it. Again. The EMTs exchanged a look, and for the first time that night, the fog seemed to thicken with something heavier than mist. A secret trying desperately not to die. Harbor Point woke slowly the next morning. The storm clouds still bruised the sky, hanging low above the waterfront like a warning that hadn't finished speaking. At St. Mary's Hospital, the halls smelled faintly of salt water carried in on soaked boots and adrenaline. In room 214, Sergeant Lucas Reed drifted somewhere between pain and memory. The world came to him in fragments. The wet concrete beneath him, the boy's steady voice counting compressions, the feel of a familiar muzzle pressed against his shoulder. Shadow. Of all the ghosts from his past, that dog was the one he never expected to see again. Lucas tried to sit up, but the stitches along his ribs pulled hard. A nurse pressed him gently back. You're lucky, she said softly. If help had come 5 minutes later, we'd be having a very different conversation. Lucky, the word sat strangely in his chest. He didn't feel lucky. He felt unfinished. Caught between the case he'd been chasing and the years of unanswered questions still clinging to him like wet rope. The door opened. Detective Aaron Walsh stepped inside, tall, sharp-eyed, carrying the controlled stillness of someone who'd spent her adult life walking crime scenes with a knot in her stomach. Her coat was still damp at the hem. Reed, she said quietly. I heard you tried to die last night. Lucas managed a weak smirk. Didn't try. Just happened. Her eyes flicked to his bandages, then hardened. You said something about a container. 47B. That wasn't random. Because nothing about this is random, Lucas murmured. Aaron pulled up a chair. A shadow crossed her face. One deeper than fatigue. 10 years ago, she began. My younger brother died in that old cold storage warehouse. Official reports said accidental fire. But I never believed that. Last night, hearing you repeat that container number. She paused. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. Lucas felt the room tilt slightly, pieces clicking together in his mind. Then we're chasing the same ghost. No, Aaron corrected softly. The ghost found you first. Across town, in their small apartment above the laundromat, Miguel was rinsing dried blood off his hands. Not his own, Lucas's. It clung to his skin even after 2 washes, a reminder of how close the night had come to shattering everything. In the living room, Noah sat curled on the floor beside Shadow, who was resting with one leg bandaged after tearing a paw pad on the concrete. Noah stroked the dog's fur methodically. One long pass, pause, one long pass. His breathing had steadied, but his eyes still flicked toward the door every few seconds. Unsure if the world outside was safe yet, Miguel crouched beside his son. You were brave, he whispered. Noah didn't look up. He would have died. Yes, Miguel replied. But you didn't freeze. You didn't run. Noah's fingers tightened around the dog's fur. Shadow went first. I just followed. Miguel exhaled shakily. How do you explain to a child, especially a child who sees the world in patterns rather than feelings, that following courage is sometimes the bravest thing of all? He didn't. Instead, he touched Noah's shoulder, and for once, Noah didn't flinch. At the hospital, Aaron stood to leave. We'll talk again, she said. This isn't over. Lucas nodded, eyes dark with something deeper than pain. It started 10 years ago, he murmured. And last night, someone tried to make sure it never ends. Aaron paused at the doorway. Then we don't let them. Outside, the storm clouds shifted, rolling inland. Harbor Point braced for the next wave. Because secrets that stay buried too long always come back up through the tide. By midday, news traveled faster than the storm front rolling in from the Atlantic. A rescue like that. A quiet boy, a retired K-9, and a father who refused to leave a stranger behind. Was the kind of story a coastal town starved for hope would cling to. Before Miguel even finished his morning coffee, someone knocked on the apartment door. It was a woman in a red windbreaker with a microphone tucked under her arm, followed by a cameraman whose shoes still squeaked from the damp outside. Mr. Castillo, she asked, breath fogging in the cold hallway. I'm Jenna from Channel 7. We heard what your son did last night. We'd love to feature him. And your dog. On the evening news. Miguel hesitated, gripping the door frame as if steadying himself. Behind him, Noah sat cross-legged on the living room rug, arranging train figurines into perfect geometric rows. Shadow lay beside him, chin resting on his paws, ears flicking gently as if monitoring every sound. Miguel forced a polite smile. I don't think that's a good idea, Jenna blinked. But this is a beautiful story. The community should know. People want to help. That was what Miguel feared. Help meant pity. Pity meant debt. Emotional or otherwise. And he'd spent years trying to shield Noah from becoming a project in other people's eyes. No cameras today, Miguel said softly. My son's overwhelmed enough. Jenna nodded, to her credit, but disappointment flickered across her face. All right, but if you change your mind. He closed the door gently before she finished. Later that afternoon, Detective Aaron Walsh arrived. Not with a camera crew, but with 2 paper cups of hot cider and a quiet knock. Miguel opened the door, wary but less guarded. I'm not here for a story, Aaron said. Just to see how Noah's doing. Miguel exhaled. He's processing in his way. Aaron stepped inside. Noah didn't look up, but his hand drifted toward Shadow, fingers brushing the dog's fur with practiced comfort. He saved a life last night, Aaron murmured. Miguel shook his head. He reacted. Shadow led. You showed up, Aaron cut in gently, and you taught him enough courage to follow the dog instead of running. That matters. Miguel glanced at his hands, still raw from scrubbing away dried blood. I can't accept donations, he said suddenly. If people ask to help, I can't. I won't let Noah feel like he's a burden. Aaron studied him for a long moment. Help isn't always charity, she said quietly. Sometimes it's community trying to honor the good it sees. But Miguel only looked away, jaw tightening. He wasn't ashamed of struggling. He was ashamed of being seen struggling. That evening, when Miguel finally stepped outside to catch his breath, he found a small envelope on the doormat. No name, just a simple note inside, for Shadow's food and Noah's quiet courage. No spotlight, no questions, just thanks. A grocery store gift card slipped out. Miguel closed his eyes. He didn't cry, but something inside him loosened. The smallest, first crack in a wall he'd built too high for too long. The deeper Aaron dug, the colder Harbor Point felt. Rain hammered against the precinct windows as she sifted through files long buried beneath dust and indifference. The cold storage warehouse fire from 10 years ago. The one that claimed her younger brother Liam. Had always lingered like unfinished business in the back of her mind. But today, it resurfaced with teeth. Half the documents were missing. The remaining half contradicted each other, and in 2 separate reports. Years apart, written by different officers. The same number appeared, 47B, a container number, not an aisle, not a sector, a cargo unit, something, or someone, had been inside that container before the flames devoured the warehouse. Erin leaned back in her chair, fingers tightening around the folder. Liam, what did you see that night? A knock at her door pulled her from the spiral. It was Lucas. Pale, stitched, walking slowly but determined, against medical orders. You're supposed to be in bed, she muttered. He ignored the comment, easing into the seat across from her. Tell me what you found. She pushed the file toward him. He skimmed the pages, expression darkening. This number, I saw it again last night, marked on the corner of the container they were trying to move. Then it's not coincidence, Aaron said. It's continuity. Lucas swallowed. Someone tried to silence me before I could connect the dots. Someone tried to silence my brother before he ever had the chance. A quiet storm settled between them. 2 people staring at overlapping wounds. Meanwhile, across town, Noah sat on the living room floor, flipping through his notebook with nervous precision. Shadow, bandaged but alert, watched him closely, tail thumping every few moments. On one page, Noah had drawn a grid of container numbers he'd memorized from walks around the docks. On another, he'd sketched the cold storage warehouse. Its sagging roofline, the scorched walls still visible after a decade. But it was the third page that made him pause. He touched the sketch with 2 fingers, tracing the number carefully, 47B circled twice. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking despite the injury. "You remember it too," Noah whispered. He flipped to a new page and wrote, "Shadow stiffened every time we passed the warehouse." Something clicked, not in words. Noah rarely thought in sentences, but in shapes, in sequences, in patterns. Shadow reacted to danger. Shadow reacted to memory. Shadow reacted to that number, and Shadow had once belonged to. Noah froze. "Lucas," he breathed. Shadow whined softly, as if confirming what Noah couldn't articulate. Across harbor winds that screamed against the shutters, a single understanding settled in the boy's chest. The dog had known long before any human did, and the past was not done with any of them. At the precinct, Erin looked at Lucas. "If this is connected, your attack wasn't about smuggling," she said. "It was about history." Lucas nodded slowly. "And the people who burned that warehouse once are moving again." Through the storm, a freight horn wailed. Low, mournful, and far too timed to be coincidence. Harbor Point's ghosts were waking. By late afternoon, the sky over Harbor Point had turned the color of bruised steel. Wind peeled across the waterfront, rattling loose shingles and scattering gulls before they could settle. Every barometer in town dipped low. Every fisherman muttered the same omen. "A nor'easter's coming," the kind that swallows docks whole. Inside the Castillo apartment, the lights flickered as Noah sat pressed against the living room heater. Shadow curled protectively beside him, the rhythmic clack of train tracks, usually comforting, was drowned by the howl of wind pushing against the glass. Miguel paced the small kitchen, phone wedged between shoulder and ear. "I know it's short notice," he said, voice stretched thin, "but I can cover the night shift." "Yes, I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and sighed. A sound carved from exhaustion and necessity. "Noah," he said gently, kneeling in front of his son, "Papa has to go to work. Hospitals get busy during storms." Noah didn't respond, eyes fixed on Shadow's breathing. Miguel cupped Noah's cheek, a touch his son usually resisted. Tonight, Noah leaned into it, just barely. "I'll be back before midnight," Miguel promised. "No going out, not even on the porch. Storm's too dangerous." Noah nodded once, but his eyes drifted toward the notebook on the table, toward the page marked 47B, toward the freight schedule taped to the wall. 6:45 p.m., cargo pickup. 7:10 p.m., special container clearance before storm lockdown. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the page. The number glowed back at him, 47B. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, body stiffening as if sensing a signal only he understood. Then came the moment that shattered the room's fragile calm. A breaking news alert flashed on the muted TV. A grainy shot of the docks as workers rushed to secure freight. Among the containers behind the reporter, tilted at a slight angle, was one number, 47B. Noah's breath hitched. His fingers fluttered against his notebook. Pattern, movement, timing. They were moving the container. Now, during the storm, Shadow stood, despite his healing leg, and nudged Noah's knee. A soft whine escaped the dog's throat. Miguel grabbed his jacket. "Papa has to go. You stay. Promise?" Noah nodded again, but this time it was automatic. His mind 3 steps ahead, threading through sounds, numbers, warnings like constellations. As soon as the door shut behind Miguel, Shadow trotted to the window, tail stiff, gaze locked on the docks barely visible through sheets of rain. Noah whispered, "They're moving it, tonight." Shadow whined and nudged the boy's wrist again, harder, despite the storm pounding against the building. Despite his fear of loud noises. Despite Miguel's warning. Noah stood up. He pulled on his yellow raincoat, the one that made him look like a lighthouse beacon in the dark. He slipped his notebook under his arm, tugged the hood low over his headphones, and clipped Shadow's leash gently to the dog's collar. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He pushed the door with his nose, eager, urgent. The hallway light flickered. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the stairwell rails. Noah froze for 3 seconds. Counting, breathing, grounding. Then whispered, "We go." And into the storm they stepped. The wind tore at their coats. Rain stung Noah's cheeks like needles. Shadow leaned into him to steady his steps. Together, a boy who feared noise and a dog who feared nothing walked toward the darkest corner of the Harbor Point docks, where secrets were being loaded into trucks and a past that refused to die was waking once more. The storm did not welcome them. It consumed them. Wind slammed against Noah's small frame, whipping the hood of his raincoat back and forth. Rain hit so hard it felt like thrown pebbles. The docks, usually noisy with clanking metal and gull cries, were now a world of roaring darkness. Shadow stayed glued to Noah's side, body angled so the boy could lean into him. Every few steps, he looked back to make sure Noah was still there. Every few steps, he pressed forward again, urgency burning through the limp in his back leg. They reached the chain-link fence that bordered the old cold storage warehouse. A section had been peeled upward, likely by the same hands who once set the fire. Shadow squeezed through effortlessly. Noah hesitated, then followed, scraping his elbow on the rough metal. Beyond the fence, the world shifted. The wind carried voices, sharp, rushed. Too close. Noah stopped breathing for a moment. Shadow froze beside him, ears forward, stance low. Through the sheets of rain, two silhouettes moved between stacks of containers, flashlights cutting through the dark. A truck idled nearby, back ramp lowered, engine vibrating like a predator's growl. And there, tilted on a damaged forklift, Container 47B. One of the men kicked a crate. "We have 10 minutes before lockdown. Move it," the other muttered. "If Reed's alive, he's talking. We finish this tonight." Noah's pulse hammered against his ribs. They hurt him, on purpose. They burned the warehouse. They hurt Lucas. They would hurt anyone. He lifted his phone with trembling fingers. Shadow nudged his arm, urging caution, but Noah steadied himself and pressed record. The screen fogged instantly from the rain, but the audio. Voices, truck engine, container latch. Caught everything. Then lightning split the sky. For one blinding second, the entire yard lit up white. And Noah's yellow raincoat flashed like a beacon. "There!" one man shouted. "Kid!" Noah gasped and stumbled back, palms hitting cold concrete, his breath fractured. Shallow, panicked, the world dissolved into noise, wind, shouts, the slam of boots on metal, the thud of crates, too loud, too fast, too much. Shadow moved before Noah could think. The old K9 lunged forward, teeth bared, a raw, fearless snarl ripping through the storm. The nearest man swung a metal bar, but Shadow dodged, clamped his jaws around the man's forearm, and dragged him away from Noah with the full force of old instincts long thought retired. "Get the dog off!" the man bellowed. The second man rushed toward Noah. Shadow released and pivoted. But the metal bar struck his ribs, hard, the sound. A wet, dull crack made Noah's vision tunnel. Shadow staggered sideways, legs trembling, breath knocked out. "No!" Noah screamed. A sound torn out of him, raw and childlike and terrified. The second man grabbed Noah by the wrist. But Shadow, wounded and panting, launched again. He hit the man's legs, slamming him into a pallet stack. The impact sent crates tumbling, buying seconds. Precious seconds. Noah scrambled backward, shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. His other hand pressed over his ears, fighting the sensory overload that threatened to break him. He needed to call someone who would listen. He pressed the emergency contact Aaron had given him earlier. Rain, static, a voice connecting. "Detective Walsh," Noah gasped. "Container, 47B, docks, there, Shadow's hurt." A shout, A clatter. The phone slipped from his wet hands and skidded across the ground, landing in a puddle with a splash. Shadow's snarl was now a hoarse, guttural sound. Fueled not by strength, but by love and duty, he forced himself between Noah and the men again, absorbing blow after blow. He didn't retreat, not once, but he was slowing. One man raised the metal bar a final time, aiming for Shadow's skull. Headlights exploded through the rain. A black sedan skidded into the yard, tires screaming. Doors flew open. Lucas Reed, still bandaged, stumbled out with a flashlight in shaking hands. Behind him, Erin Walsh drew her weapon, voice cutting through the storm. "Police! Step away from the boy and the dog!" Chaos erupted. The men bolted. Lucas caught one by the collar, dragging him down despite the pain splitting his side. Erin tackled the second. Noah crawled towards Shadow, who collapsed onto the wet concrete, chest heaving, eyes half-lidded, but fixed on the boy. "No, no, no, no," Noah whispered, hands hovering above the dog's trembling body. Stay with me, please." Shadow gave one faint wag of his tail. Slow, tired, but certain. A gesture that said, "I kept you safe. Now do the same for me." And Noah, drenched and shaking, wrapped his arms around the dog who had given everything for him, while sirens approached in the distance. The storm still raging, the truth finally awake, and Harbor Point forever changed. Dawn came late to Harbor Point. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind streets rinsed clean, rooftops glistening with seawater, and a sky the color of faded porcelain. The world felt bruised, but breathing. Inside the animal clinic, fluorescent lights hummed softly as Noah slept curled in a chair, his head resting against Miguel's side. The boy had fought sleep for hours, refusing to close his eyes until the operating room door finally swung open at 4:17 a.m. Shadow had survived, barely. But he had survived. Dr. Meredith's voice echoed in Miguel's thoughts even now. "He's a fighter. He didn't lose consciousness. That's rare for trauma. This severe, someone or something he loves must have been anchoring him." Noah. The boy hadn't said a word afterward. Just pressed both palms against the recovery kennel window and breathed, slowly, until Shadow's taped-up tail wagged once in recognition. Now, as morning softened the clinic walls, Noah stirred awake. "Dad," he whispered, sitting up abruptly. Miguel brushed his hair back gently. "He's still here, mijo, still fighting." Noah slid off the chair and padded quietly toward the recovery ward, still wearing his yellow raincoat like a badge of last night's courage. He stood in front of Shadow's kennel, trembling with relief at the faint puff of breath fogging the glass. Shadow opened one eye, not fully, just enough to say, "I'm not going anywhere," across town. By mid-morning, news of the attempted abduction and the break in the cold case warehouse fire had spread through Harbor Point like sunrise on water. People appeared at the clinic one by one. Mrs. D'Angelo from the bakery, carrying a box of warm cinnamon rolls. Mr. Wu from the tackle shop, dropping off blankets in case the dog needs extra warmth. Two harbor workers who had never met Miguel before, leaving a sealed envelope with a simple message. For Shadow, a real one. Even the fire chief stopped by, jaw tight, voice low. "We should have looked deeper 10 years ago," he murmured to Erin. "Now we will." Harbor Point. Fractured, weather-beaten, often divided by its own hardships, had found something to hold on to, a boy who couldn't always speak for himself, a dog who had once been forgotten, and a night that proved both still mattered. Back at the clinic, Lucas entered slowly, one hand pressed to his side as fresh pain reminded him of every inch he'd risked the night before. But when he saw Noah standing guard beside Shadow's kennel, something inside him steadied. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "Told you he's tough." Noah nodded without looking away from Shadow. "You came," the boy whispered. Lucas blinked. "Of course. You called for help." Noah shook his head. "No, I mean, you came back to him." Shadow gave another soft wag. Slower this time, but unmistakably proud. Lucas swallowed hard. I should never have left him, he said. But I won't make that mistake again. Miguel stepped forward, rubbing a tired hand over his face. What happens now? He asked Aaron. Aaron glanced toward the window, where the wind carried hints of sunlight. We move on the case. The men arrested last night confessed enough to reopen everything. Harbor Point may finally get its truth. She turned back to Noah and Shadow. And we make sure these two never stand alone again. As the morning light filled the room, Noah rested his forehead against the glass of the kennel, whispering, Shadow, I'm here. Always. And Shadow, stitched and bruised but unbroken, closed his eyes in peaceful answer. Harbor Point had changed. Noah had changed. Shadow had changed everything. 1 month later, winter arrived quietly in Harbor Point, not with storms or sirens this time, but with calm mornings, pale sunlight, and a kind of stillness the town hadn't felt in years. Snow dusted the rooftops like sifted sugar, frost traced delicate lacework along window panes, and the ocean, usually roaring, softened to a steady, shimmering breath. Inside the Castillo apartment, warmth filled the rooms again. The heater hummed. Bread baked in the oven Miguel had finally saved enough to repair, and beside the living room couch, wrapped in a soft navy blanket, lay Shadow. Awake, alert, healed enough to stand, but milking his recovery privileges with shameless dignity. Noah sat cross-legged beside him, flipping through a fresh notebook. The first page read, Shadow's patterns, the places he saved me. Shadow lifted his head whenever Noah shifted, his tail brushing lightly against the floorboards. A sound now synonymous with home. The abandoned warehouse. Once a monument to Harbor Point's most painful mystery, was now surrounded by yellow tape and construction markers. The investigation led by Aaron and Lucas had uncovered everything the town was never meant to know. Corruption, smuggling routes, and the truth behind the fire that took Liam Walsh's life 10 years earlier. Closure did not erase grief, but it mended something broken. And Aaron, for the first time in a decade, breathed fully as she walked past the ruins, knowing her brother's story would no longer be whispered. It would be known, honored, and finally allowed to rest. A banner stretched across the entrance. K-9 Companionship and First Response Training. In honor of Shadow and Noah Castillo. Kids lined the gymnasium floor, kneeling beside therapy dogs and retired service animals brought in from nearby counties. Lucas, still favoring one side, stood beside Aaron as she introduced the program. This isn't about heroism, Aaron said, voice steady through the microphone. It's about teaching our young people what Noah showed us that night. That courage is quiet, steady, and grows strongest when shared with someone who believes in you. Miguel stood beside his son, one hand resting gently on Noah's shoulder. The boy held Shadow's leash, chest puffed with pride, eyes soft with certainty. He wasn't hiding behind patterns anymore. He wasn't standing alone. When the applause rose, Noah didn't flinch. He didn't cover his ears. Instead, he looked down at Shadow and smiled. Shadow nudged him back. Partners. Always. The Castillo apartment glowed golden against the blue of early night. Miguel stirred a pot of soup on the stove. Lucas sat at the table repairing a broken toy boat for Noah. Aaron stopped by with a small box of homemade cookies from Mrs. D'Angelo. Smells like a real home in here, she said. Miguel grinned. Feels like one, too. Noah curled beside Shadow on the couch, whispering a thought he'd been holding all day. Shadow. We didn't just save him, he murmured, glancing toward Lucas. I think we saved us too. Shadow exhaled, pressing his head into Noah's lap, his tail thumping softly. A heartbeat of agreement. Outside, snow began to fall again. Gentle, unhurried, as if the whole town had finally earned its quiet. And in the dim glow of their living room, a boy who once feared the world and a dog who once believed his purpose was gone, rested together. Proof that healing doesn't need miracles, just love, just loyalty, just two beings who refuse to give up on each other. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't come from badges, uniforms, or headlines, but from a quiet boy who sees the world differently and a retired canine who refuses to let his story end in silence. Shadow didn't just save Noah, and Noah didn't just save Shadow. Together, they reminded Harbor Point and all of us that loyalty can outlast fear, that healing can grow from the smallest moments, and that heroes truly do walk beside us on four paws. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because here at Pawprints of Valor, we believe every paw print carries a story, and some of them can change a life. Not all angels have wings. Some limp, heal, and still choose to stand between us and the storm.